Welcome. In today's explainer, we're unpacking a concept that literally shapes our entire reality, the state. What is it? Where did it actually come from? And exactly how much power should it have over our daily lives? We're going to explore how wildly different political ideologies answer these questions. By looking at the origin, purpose, and ideal level of power of the state, we can get a much better grip on the systems that govern our world today. So let's jump right in.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, the divine origin theory. Second, minimalists and the stateless. Third, the Marxist evolution. Fourth, community and welfare states. And finally, the fascist total state.
All right, part one, the divine origin theory. So where did the state actually come from? Well, the earliest justifications were pretty straightforward. Under the divine theory, which is famously tied to King James I's writings on the law of free monarchies, and to Robert Filmer's idea of patriarchy, the state is presented as the direct handiwork of God. Under this view, monarchs weren't just politicians, right? They were divinely appointed rulers whose authority was absolute and unquestionable simply because it came from a higher power. But of course, as human thought evolved, so did the pushback. This theory has been heavily criticized as unhistorical, reactionary, and just plain unscientific. With a total lack of empirical evidence backing it up, Enlightenment scholars realized they needed completely new ways to either justify or challenge the state's existence. And that set the perfect stage for some radically new ways of thinking about governance. Which brings us to part two, minimalists and the stateless. Let's start at absolute zero. The word anarchist literally means without a ruler. Thinkers like William Godwin and Peter Kropotkin looked at the state and saw fundamentally unnecessary coercive force. To them, liberty exists completely outside the domain of the state. They opposed capitalism and economic exploitation and instead championed free will, decentralization, and free associations. For anarchists, any form of centralized government is an obstacle to true social equality. But, not everyone who fears state overreach wants to abolish the whole thing. Liberals, for instance, favor the rule of law, competitive free markets, and a state acting mainly as a neutral agent, though modern liberalism can certainly extend into a welfare state. Libertarians, on the other hand, go a lot further. They completely oppose the welfare state, progressive taxation, and affirmative action. Their ultimate goal? A strictly minimal state whose only real job is protecting property and keeping the peace. Moving on to part three, the Marxist evolution.
Now, the Marxist view is fascinating because it argues that the type of society actually determines the scope of the state. Classical Marxism sees the state simply as an instrument of class rule, a tool for the elite to maintain control. The idea was that following a revolution, the state would eventually wither away into a stateless, classless society. But post-World War II, contemporary Marxists had to face a different reality. The state didn't wither away, it actually grew stronger under the dictatorship of the proletariat, extending its reach deeply into art, culture, and media.
Because of this historical reality, where the state centralized even further instead of disappearing, contemporary Marxist thinkers completely revised their stance. They argued that any future transition to socialism essentially must be democratic. They emphasized that each state requires its own specific historical analysis. It's a massive shift from that classical revolutionary expectation to a much more nuanced view.
Next up, part four, community and welfare states. Before diving into large-scale welfare, we have to touch on the communitarian perspective. Thinkers like Alasdair MacIntyre and Michael Walzer take a different angle. They emphasized respect for authority and shared social values, arguing that individuals are actually constituted through their community. So, rather than seeing the state as purely a neutral umpire or a tool of oppression, they believe the state and community culture are absolutely essential for shaping who we are as individuals.
Building on that idea of shared societal benefit, we find social democratic welfare. This ideology keeps socialism as a socioeconomic ideal, but it entirely rejects revolutionary methods in favor of peaceful, evolutionary change. Its priorities are super clear. It seeks general welfare and a deep respect for human freedom. It relies on planning to achieve economic growth, and notably, it favors state regulation rather than outright state ownership. And these theories didn't just stay on paper. We saw the social democratic model implemented in the real world, like during India's Nehruvian era. You also saw this exact same pattern sweep across Western Europe after World War II, where social democratic parties came to power in places like West Germany, Sweden, and Great Britain, as well as in various Latin American countries. It represents a highly active state, but one that is strictly bound by democratic consent and focused on citizen welfare.
But this brings us to a much darker, pressing question. We've looked at states that want to be invisible, states that want to wither away, and states that want to regulate for welfare. So, what happens when the state demands absolute total control?
Our final stop, Part 5, the fascist total state. Let's look closely at this perspective. Fascism calls for a powerful state, extreme militaristic nationalism, contempt for electoral democracy, and open opposition to political liberalism. It is fundamentally built on a belief in natural hierarchy and rule by elites. Fascism glorifies the nation and gives the state control over literally every aspect of life. This is the concept of the total state. It is absolute in its methods and totally unlimited by law. The individual is completely subordinated and absorbed into the state, as if it were a single organic whole, supposedly for their own good.
How does a total state actually maintain that kind of grip? Well, it relies on a few core mechanisms. You typically have a charismatic leader leaning heavily on social Darwinism and elite rule. You see the constant, unavoidable use of patriotic mottos, slogans, and symbols. Flags are absolutely everywhere. A critical component is the identification of enemies or scapegoats as a unifying cause to rally and distract the public. Add in tightly controlled mass media and a government that intertwines itself with religion, and you have the complete architecture of totalitarian control.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer. From Plato's ethical state, to Hobbes' absolute sovereign, to the modern debate between welfare states, minimal states, and no state at all, the concept of the state has never stood still. It remains one of the most fiercely contested ideas in political thought. As you look at the world around us right now, which of these ideologies do you see at play? And more importantly, which theory will define the societies of our future? Thanks for joining